This video is going to look at Bikini and Enewetak atolls, nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean. Basically, what we're doing here is we're looking at cultural changes in the Pacific Ocean, uh, and we're also looking at environmental changes as well, most of which are going to be largely the result of advances in nuclear technology, as well as conflict. So the Pacific Ocean, really since the beginning of the 1900s, has changed into an area on one hand that has connected the economies and the cultures of East Asia and Southeast Asia with that of North and South America, uh, and by those connections, even brought it into an important role in the global world. So this today is what we would refer to as, or what we do refer to as, the Pacific Rim. So all of this area here, as well as connecting the west coast of the United States of America, this is an important social and economic region that connects our global economy. When we take a look at the early 1900s, what did the Pacific Ocean look like? Well, there were really two major powers that had claims in this area. There was the Empire of Japan here on the western side, and then, of course, the United States of America over here. Now, there were some other imperial powers as well. You had the Dutch that were located down in this area, you had the French in this area, you had the British, and then a bunch of other countries, ranging from the United States to Britain to Japan to Germany, Italy, all these other countries had basically divided up this entire coastal region of China into spheres of influence. But when World War II broke out, the two major powers that were going to be involved in this conflict, it's going to be Japan and it was the United States of America. Although Britain did play an important role, especially operating out of South Asia and out of Australia. So going into World War II, what did the playing field look like? Well, you had the Japanese; they had their home country here, but they also had a presence in some of these Mariana Islands out here. You had the United States of America. Our main bases were anchored at Pearl Harbor and Midway Island. The Aleutian Islands extended all the way out into this area. We occupied the Philippines as well. And so these are going to be your two major powers in the region. So if I actually wanted to kind of color code this, it would look a little bit more like this right here. So going into World War II, the Japanese Empire devised a military strategy in which they would create what was called this Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. What it really was is they wanted to go out and they wanted to conquer all of these islands in the South Pacific. They wanted to conquer the Dutch East Indies. They wanted to conquer Southeast Asia. They had already started to conquer into China in the 1930s. And the idea was to bring it into the Japanese Empire and then basically draw on all these different regions for resources. And if anything is a good kind of like measure of how the Japanese were probably going to rule it, all we had to do was take a look at Korea. All we had to do was take a look at Guam. Or, sorry, not Guam, but some of their South Pacific islands. And here, usually, what the Japanese did is they oftentimes looked down on other Asian peoples as they did have racial views of other cultures. So they looked down on them as like second-class citizens. Koreans could be treated pretty roughly as well. So it would be it really wouldn't be co-prosperity in the way that they were likening it. It would have been Japanese citizens having the best places in their societies, followed by everybody else. And so it was kind of similar to what the United States had, in which you had whites that really kind of had access to all the good things in life, and then African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, they experienced segregation and discrimination. So kind of had almost mirrors when you take a look at these two different cultures. So from the very beginning of the World War II, that's what the Japanese did. They followed the plan admirably right off the beginning, struck out, took the Philippine Islands very quickly and the American military bases there, struck out, they hit Pearl Harbor. They quickly started expanding throughout the South Pacific Ocean, started threatening Australia, conquered into Southeast Asia. The only problem is that when they hit Pearl Harbor, they really didn't do enough damage to fulfill their objective of putting the American war effort far enough back to where the Americans would basically sue for peace. They damaged a lot of ships, they killed a lot of lives, but they left most of the infrastructure there. And of course, the United States, we had a large body of troops on the mainland that could, quickly go out there and refill the losses. So right off the bat, the United States of America struck, and they struck quickly. One thing they did is they kind of snuck out a fleet right here, just to the extreme edge of where bombers could be launched from the deck of an aircraft carrier, which was pretty remarkable. It's called the Doolittle Raid. And they flew to Tokyo, they bombed it, and then they ditched and landed in China immediately afterwards, proving to the Japanese that they could be hit from without the United States of America even having any bases out here. But the main battle was at Midway in early 1942, in which the United States and the Japanese naval forces engaged outside of this small little island. In the United States of America, sank most of the Japanese fleet's aircraft carriers, which, going into World War II, that was the dominant military vessel in naval warfare. So after that, the American strategy was very basic. We engaged in what was called island hopping. Sent out two fleets. The Central Fleet was directly guided by Chester Nimitz, and they were just basically going and capturing islands, with Iwo Jima and Okinawa being their main targets. Because if we could capture those, we could basically start launching bombers at will at Japan. And then down here in the far south, these were U.S. naval vessels under the control of Douglas MacArthur in the U.S. Army, and they were just island hopping across the Dutch East Indies. Their main goal was the Philippines, and then from there to link up with Nimitz fleet at Okinawa and prepare for the invasion of Japan. And it was projected that it was going to cost us at least a good 1 million U.S. casualties to invade the islands of Japan, because the Japanese people, going back to this Code of Bushido that had been a holdover from the days of the samurai, held that all Japanese citizens, owed their life to the emperor, and so they would lay it down. So we expected the entire Japanese population to take up arms against us in defense of their homeland. What ended up happening, though, is we had a project that had been ongoing, really before World War II started. As early as the 1930s, we knew that the Germans were attempting to harness the power of the atom. And so we had scientists in the United States and in Britain that were, studying nuclear energy. When Hitler began persecuting Jewish citizens, we received a lot of refugees, especially high-ranking, very intelligent scientists like Albert Einstein, who advanced our understanding of quantum physics. And so what basically happened is from 42 to 46, we, accelerated the process of, weaponizing nuclear energy at the Manhattan Project. And in Operation Trinity, July 16th, we detonated our first test warhead, which released the equivalent of 16.9 kilotons. That's thousands of tons of TNT, a high explosive. So with the successful test, we basically had enough fissile material left for 2 nuclear weapons. So what Truman did is he decided, all right, we're going to try to stop this war quickly. So he actually sent out a warning to the Japanese saying, hey, you got a new bomb, and it's got more devastating power than anything you can imagine. You need to surrender. Which the Japanese, of course, refused to do, and so they, on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay delivered Little Boy to the city of Hiroshima, which was an industrial center, and it did have some military forces there. But at the end of the day, the reason we chose that one is it had clear skies. And what we wanted to do with this bomb and the following bomb was to be able to measure the amount of destruction on a civilian population. So we dropped the bomb. It ended up with 66,000 people dead, 69,000 wounded, many of whom would later succumb to radiation poisoning, for a total of 135,000 casualties, one bomb. And so here is a picture of Little Boy, and that's a picture of Hiroshima after the bomb fell. So we waited 3 days before dropping the next bomb because Truman hoped, first off, that the emperor would come to his senses and we wouldn't need to resort to such mass killing, again. But the Emperor Hirohito, he couldn't fathom, he couldn't comprehend the idea of one bomb, one plane causing that much damage. He thought it had to be enemy propaganda. So on August 9th, Truman authorized the dropping of Fat Man. And this bomb was less powerful than Little Boy, largely because of the terrain of Hiroshima, of Nagasaki, a lot of mountainous areas. So at the end of the day, 39,000 dead, 25,000 wounded, a total of 64,000. And so what I was telling you about, civilian populations and being able to measure the destructive power, all you have to do to understand is to take a look at these two photos. The U.S. military mapped out ahead of time exactly where they wanted to place these bombs. They wanted to choose areas with certain structures that they could identify in the before and after. So here what we're looking at is the stadium. And so what we can do is we can trace, okay, where are the roads? Well, they're right here. And then where's all the damage and how much damage was released, and we can see that it's total in the immediate vicinity. So August 14th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito finally capitulated after a brief attempt by the military to prevent him from doing so, and he surrendered unconditionally. Now, after that, the American interest in nuclear warfare continued, largely because Truman, foresaw a future in which our major enemy would be the Soviet Union. In fact, divisions started early. Right at the very end of World War II, we were already kind of at each other's throats. And so because of nuclear fallout, there were some areas on the mainland where we could test our nuclear weapons, especially like in the Southwest, where there are some areas that are pretty remote. But keep in mind, radiation doesn't sit still; it travels. Once a nuclear bomb goes off, all that irradiated material goes up into the sky and it drifts, and so that fallout can actually contaminate places, well away from the initial blast site. So the United States of America, what they did is they turned instead to the Pacific Ocean. Because after World War II ended, we gained control over a lot of these different areas. And so this would end up affecting the lives of a lot of Pacific Islanders. So when we look at the Pacific Island, human geography is divided up into three areas. You have the Micronesians, people of small islands out here. Melanesians, these are islands that have been divided up because of culture, but also because of physical appearance. They tended to have darker skin out in this area and had more cultural connections to the Aborigines of Australia down here. And then out here you have the Polynesians. And the Polynesians have a very similar language, and they're connected ethnically, religiously, culturally, all throughout this area. So the Maori in New Zealand speak pretty much the same language as the Maoli up here in Hawaii. In fact, they both refer to themselves as Kanaka. The only difference between the native islanders in Hawaii and New Zealand is this little consonant right here. Um, it still sounds a little more like an R in New Zealand, a little more like an L in Hawaii. So what had happened is the United States of America and the Europeans, they had already conquered and or claimed a lot of these islands prior to World War II. But following World War II, a lot of the Japanese islands, especially out here in Micronesia, became American possessions. So today, the United States of America, we claim the Pacific Islands of Hawaii. That's actually a state. You have, of course, the Wake Island out there. We still have Guam and Samoa as territories, but then we have bases in Korea, bases in Okinawa, bases on the Japanese mainland. We used to have bases as well in Micronesia. In the Philippines. And although we don't really have them anymore, we can still deploy troops to parts of Micronesia outside of Guam as well. And so today, that's kind of our main base right here. And we project our power into Asia through all of these other bases. So what we started doing is some of these islands, or most all of these islands out here, are inhabited, except for like the smallest ones that just cannot contain human populations. In the United States of America, we began to use these islands, the least populated ones, as testing sites, especially the Bikini Atoll. And so from 1946 to 1968, there would be a series of 8 different tests. So these are 18 test series, but keep in mind that each test series had multiple different detonations. So if we look at one test series alone, Operation Hardtack, it had the most detonations of all the different tests, for a total of 34 detonations combined. Enewetak, Bikini in this test had at least one of them. Enewetak 3 combined, they had 3, and this is testing of just of a hydrogen bomb, which basically made Nagasaki and Hiroshima look like firecrackers. And so 38% of those 34 detonations were all on islands. The rest were out in the open sea. And then if you take a look at Operation Ivy Mike, that was our first truly thermonuclear test. So that's the biggest nuclear bomb that we could produce at this time. And there was actually an island in the Enewetak Atoll that we literally erased from the face of the earth. And today you can actually take a boat out, well, depending on the radiation levels. But if you took a boat out there, you could actually look down through this crystal clear water and actually look at the crater that we created underneath of the surface of the ocean from the blast. So these detonations had serious impacts on the Bikini Islanders in particular. In 1951, before using their atoll for a series of tests, we moved the islanders to other islands, and we basically said, okay, once the test is over and the radiation goes away and it's safe to return, we'll bring you back. Keep in mind you're doing multiple tests on these islands. So some of these tests were so radioactive that the fallout made it impossible for the Bikini Islanders to return in their lifetime or even their grandchildren's lifetime. So a good example of just how bad these detonations were for the environment. In Operation Castle Bravo, they detonated a thermonuclear bomb that irradiated a Japanese fishing vessel that was 96 nautical miles away. And keep in mind, a nautical mile is actually a little bit longer in distance than a land mile. So that's a long ways away. The end result was these fishermen that were just out, trying to make a living, all ended up coming down with radiation sickness, acute radiation sickness, one of which, ended up with a fatality by the time they got back to port. uh, and the fatality was because of a secondary infection. So today, these islands, they still can't return. And some, Bikini Islanders fear that they never will be able to return. One thing about islands is that not all islands are built the same. There are some islands that we call high islands. And these are the ones that usually you'll see like in movies like, say, King Kong, where the island reaches way up out of the ocean surface, usually peaks up in a mountain. But then there are what we call low islands. So usually these high islands right here, they're built up from volcanic eruptions, building up soil years after years after years after years. These low islands are usually just above the ocean surface, constructed on top of coral reefs over years of erosion and soil deposits. And the problem that they're having today is global warming. So as all of those ice, glaciers are melting in Antarctica, what's happening is that the ocean levels are, of course, starting to rise. And we have measurable increases in, ocean levels in some of these islands. And so for many Bikini Islanders, they're actually having to go with Plan B now, which is buying land in other places like, American territories, because they fear, that by the time the radiation goes away, the ocean's basically going to make it impossible for them to return to their homes. So today, nuclear weapons are still a part of our key arsenal. First detonation was during World War II. We've relied on them as a means of defense ever since then. In the case of their development, though, a lot of the development was done in the Pacific Ocean, not only by us, but keep in mind, France had islands in the ocean as well that they were using for this purpose. Other countries were doing this. And today, some of these islanders who, people look at this as a remote, unpopulated part of the world. Well, it's their home. And in cases like, some of our tests, they're paying the ultimate price for it.